Welcome, everyone. My name is Scott Clinton. Today, we'll be having our webinar on why MCP agents, enabled agents, are the new cyber battleground. I want to welcome our guests. I'll be operating as moderator for this session. I'd like each of our guests to go ahead and introduce themselves as part of our conversation. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Akram?
Yeah. Hi there. I'm Akram Sharaf, working in agentic security and AI-related topics within Cisco Systems for the last 4+ years.
Jason?
Hi, I'm Jason. I work for Salesforce in a small team called Exploit AI, also doing agentic security and everything AI exploit related for the last 3+ years. I'm also part of the OWASP Gen AI security project.
Great. Ophir?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Ophir. I'm the co-founder and chief product officer for Lasso Security, a generative AI security startup.
And Or?
Hi, I'm Or. I'm a data scientist in Lasso. And yeah, also.
All right. So obviously, MCP has become a big part of the conversation around agentic architectures and agentic security. Where a big challenge for the OWASP Gen AI security project has been to kind of work together to kind of come up with some key best practices around how to address some of these new architectures. And MCP is becoming one of those key areas that we want to talk about. So let's talk a little bit first for the group around what is agentic and the role MCP plays, because we've seen so much changing so quickly in agentic architectures. Let's start giving people sort of a basic of where MCP fits, if they're not already familiar, and how that fits into these agentic architectures. Ophir, maybe you can start us off.
Yeah, I'll start it, and I hope it's not too controversial, because trying to define agents, I feel like it might be a tricky question. But I think on the most basic level, these are software systems that use AI to pursue some kind of goal and complete tasks. So that's the general definition of what I would say an agent is. But unlike traditional LLM systems or LLM-based simple systems, they have the ability to reason, to plan, and they have some kind of memory component. So if you think about the traditional and simplistic LLM-based chatbots, basically that's a brain. But if you think about the agentic architecture, it's now giving those brains some hands and legs. And now they can do action, they can think, they can act, they can memorize, or they can do a bunch of different things that are a bit more sophisticated. And MCP comes into play. First of all, MCP is just basically model context protocol. I think that's probably good to put it out there. And that's basically a standardized way for LLMs to communicate and connect with external data sources. So if you think about the traditional limitations of LLMs and apps that are based on LLMs, they are pretty much closed in the data that they have or the data that the model has. The MCP allows those systems, allow those agents to get data from other sources. And you can think about it as a unified abstraction layer to connect agentic flows to real-world data. And if I need to sum it up, like if you think about API is the way that developers communicate with systems, and MCP is the way that agents or humans communicate with data and systems in the new era.
That's great. Anybody have any other comments they want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe one thing I would like to add on to Ophir's point is MCP could be even used to have two agents interact with each other. And the way I see is MCP acting as more of a horizontal layer, wherein different execution agents can interact by sharing the contextual tools and the contextual data resources to other agents, so that real-time agentic workflows can be combined and built out. That's one thing I would like to add.
Yeah, I think that's critical. Agents are tools in the MCP world, and we haven't seen a lot of that yet in production. We're still kind of in the new stage, so people are just figuring out, how do I connect it to data? How do I connect it to resources? And it's almost really basic tools at this point. but that isn't the point, and that's not where it's going. It's agents can be tools as well. So now you've got really complex ecosystems.
Yeah, I think it's one of the challenges. Agents aren't deterministic necessarily, right? That's one of our big challenges as we start to look at these new architectures. And that leads us into all sorts of new interesting ways to think about the security risks associated with those. So, in fact, what are some of the new security risks that are being presented by both these agentic architectures and MCP? Because MCP is just one of the protocols. We have A2A, we've got other ways that agents are interacting. So, Jason, maybe you can start us out with talking a little bit about what are some of those new security risks being presented.
Sure. And I think I'm going to preface this by saying it's really hard to talk about what the risks are without sounding like a nihilistic doomsayer, because everything is so new, and MCP in particular is at a really high level just a dumpster fire from a security point of view. So it's really hard to have this discussion without sounding like you're just claiming everything's on fire and it's the worst thing ever. But in a really real way, agentic systems with MCP take like the worst of both worlds of AI and software development and smash them together in this really shiny new wrapper that everybody's super excited to use because it's cool. Basically, what you're doing is you're taking agents that are non-deterministic and giving them access to all of your critical infrastructure and data and saying, go do stuff and figure out what the best way to do it is. And that's a really scary thing, especially when you consider where the MCP servers are coming from. It's just anywhere on the internet, right? So what you're really doing, what's really happening in the case of MCP is your boundary is non-existent anymore. There's no longer such a thing as a production boundary, because your production boundary is whatever somebody decides to put into their MCP client, whether that's a remote server, some hosted anywhere on the internet, whether that's some tool that they're running locally. And trying to secure this environment is almost impossible, because really all it is Python code, right? So you're not able to take things like EDR or let's look for the binary and look for the malicious software, and those kind of traditional protections have gone away because it's just code. And at an even more difficult level, it's just language, right? So we can't do things like what does input sanitization look like when it's just language? It's a really difficult problem, and it's a problem we're struggling with in AI all over the place, but now magnified by we want to take input from anywhere on the internet and send it to our agent and say, go.
Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I 100% agree. I think it really is probably the worst of both worlds coming in together. And I would add to the equation that you're going to need to multiply it by your least capable employee, because everyone can use it. It's not a challenge. It's not a problem. You don't need to have a lot of technical skills to do something around MCP locally. So I think this problem has to be multiplied by, someone in your company who read about it somewhere and is really eager to try it, and probably doesn't have the right background to understand what it means to connect it to a remote server that someone just put out there on the internet. So I think it is a scary new thing that combines a lot of old problems, semi-old problems, and definitely a very wide access.
Yeah, and so some of the new stuff is things like what's called rug pulling or context poisoning, whatever you want to call it, right? Where you're reviewing say you are super security oriented and you look at the MCP server and you review the code, which almost nobody's going to do this, right? You're going to just trust it. You're going to do a very, very rough scan at best. But let's say you do a solid in-depth review and you say, okay, I know this thing is doing what I want it to do. This looks good. I'm approving this for use. And then 3 days later, that server gets compromised and the attacker changes the tool descriptions and does some kind of prompt injection on it, right? You probably aren't going back and checking for changes in your tooling description. You can, but almost nobody I know that I've seen right now is doing that. And that's a new problem for us, where we're used to thinking of application security in a static world where we can review the code and approve it, and it's a golden image and it's good to go, and we know it's going to be the same. And that isn't what MCP is. MCP is very dynamic, and add to that all of the agentic decision making, right? You don't know which tool it's going to call anytime you call it.
I think part of the challenge is MCP is acting both as a data server, wherein it is exposing the data resources, and it is also acting as the authorization server. And this is by default with the Anthropic's MCP specification. So that authorization specification is not well defined. Now, even with OR 2.1, if someone is trying to integrate with an MCP related workflow, there are many other security threats and vulnerabilities which can get exposed. So those are the kind of challenges which a dynamic workflow or an autonomous agentic workflow with MCP protocol is actually vulnerable to.
That's a really good point, because in a security world, you don't want a non-deterministic security control, right? You want your security controls to be deterministic. And what we've done with agentic AI and MCP in particular is say, hey, LLM, you are now our security control. Figure out what makes sense.
Yeah, I really agree about it, but I want to bring another perspective to this kind of MCP threats. The MCP, like, it's connecting to the LLM with more formatting system, like the JSON RPC message system. So it allows us to implement in it like a capability-based authentication for this kind of tools, if you want. This is something that we didn't have until now with the basic, let's say, LLM user communication. So this is a great potential for the next protocol. Yeah, but I think it's worth mentioning.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. When I say that there's no way to talk about this without sounding like a doomsayer, what I mean is the current snapshot, right? The current instance. I think we're going to get there. Give it time to mature. There's already some additional security recommendations that have been made and extensions for the protocol. So I think we'll eventually get there. But in the meantime, we've got industry rushing forward super fast to implement this right now everywhere, without, I think, really understanding what the risks are and giving the system time to mature to the point where it needs to be for real enterprise use.
Yeah, that's something that it's good to keep in mind, because I guess in a historic perspective, we are probably in the same moment that, I don't know how many years ago, someone built the first, package repository, and people were like, okay, I can now pull someone else's repository, and that's very cool. So we're probably in the same time, but on a different timeline. So it's always good to bear in mind that if you decide to use MCP, you are pioneering something. It's very new, it's very fresh. There are a lot of things that are not defined yet. And I tend to agree that the next iteration or the next protocols should be much better in terms of security.
Yeah, well, I think we're also talking about this as mostly, continues to be API based, right? So in terms of even the MCP protocol, figuring out what are the best approaches, starting with looking at your API best practices. So I know a lot of people look at this and go, can we just apply our same approach we do with APIs right now, applied to their MCP? So, but is that really the case is the question. Sounding like perhaps not, maybe. Or maybe you can give us a little bit more detail on, sort of how the differences, Akram, on sort of the differences between APIs and MCP security, some different, because I know people are looking at them very much like, here's another API protocol for me to kind of deal with. I can just use my existing tool sets to do that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. Yeah. So if you take traditional API security is applicable much more for a deterministic API workflow, wherein the API endpoint is well defined and the authorization specification is well defined. And then a developer would know ahead of time, a priori, hey, this is the API endpoint and this is what we'll be exposing from this particular application via externally or via internal resources. Now with an MCP server, the challenge is any developer would not know ahead of time what is actually getting exposed or which particular tool call is actually happening in real time. And part of the challenge is, yes, there are some tools, the agentic tools, which are purely API based, but then there are some agentic tools which are Python decorator functions based as well. And those are the kind of tool calls for which existing API security solutions would not be applicable to. You cannot do a fine fingerprinting, or you cannot do a heat map based analysis, which traditional existing API security solutions out there in the market are very much accommodating and using at this point of time. And that's something MCP is actually having a lot of issues with as on today, I would say. And part of the challenge is API security solutions can be used, but that they would solve only 30 to 40% of the problem. On top of it, you need to have custom MCP security based solutions which can address the remaining 60 to 70% of the problems related to the real time agentic tool calls, which the LLMs would actually invoke. And because LLMs look into the tool description, the tool schema, and then what is the contextual nature of the incoming natural language prompt, any developer would not be knowing, hey, which is my agentic tool call, which would get called at time T1 or at time T2 and so on. And that's part of the reason why they cannot do a heat map based analysis or a fingerprinting based analysis as well. So that's the delineation between existing API security and then the MCP based security, and why there is a need for having a new product to address the MCP security challenges in the new AI native era.
I think that's a really important point that you hit on there, with that need for custom code for the additional 60 to 70%, because industry is looking at MCP as, hey, this gets us cool tools that we can use to really increase our velocity a ton. But there's this huge upfront cost that comes with that, which is I've got to invest time in developing this 60 to 70% secure product. And that's a good expectation for, I think, industry leaders and like CISOs and stuff to be aware of as they look at how are we going to increase velocity. Yes, you will eventually increase velocity, but you also have to invest this cost.
And I think part of the challenge is some of the CISOs are not aware, and some of the industry practitioners are also not aware, and they assume the API security is equal to MCP security or an agentic security as well. But then MCP security or agentic security is much more of a superset than a traditional API security. That's something which requires additional education and probably thought leadership to share that knowledge in the industry to the CISOs and CIOs as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times we had gone for API security, especially around LLMs. We've kind of jumped into, I think one of the default first deployments people did was around some LLM type firewall, right? So again, starting to jump into addressing the traditional API security, put a firewall in, help start down that process and that path. But, agentic security, as you point out, is still different. So as we look at traditional kind of LLM-based firewall type approaches that people have started out with, how does that fit, or how's that different or apply for MCP? I think you talked a little bit about it, Akram, or do you have some thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, if you take the first generation of LLM-based applications back in 2023 timeframe, all the way till later half of 2023, they can be solved by using an AI firewall. By that, what I mean is, if there is a prompt manipulation or if there is a prompt poisoning related security attack, then you could have some kind of a data plane workflow within an AI firewall which can detect and then apply some kind of guardrail. The guardrail could be again applied at the input layer or at the output layer to solve the problem. This was very much applicable and it hold very good. But with agentic related design patterns, you have this notion of tools, you have the short-term memory, and then you have an LLM call, which is just one component within the agentic runtime. And that's where existing AI firewall related products or solutions would not be really applicable for solving some of these agentic related security attacks. Yes, there might be some overlap for the basic use cases, but when it comes to real-time autonomous agentic workflows, which is where the power of agentic workflows come into play, I don't think existing AI firewall products would be able to address those security-related gaps. That's my perspective.
Yeah, I really agree. I think like this type of security solutions need to work together. So in a high level, the MCP is functioning like a one-to-many layer. It's connecting the LLM to all other tools. And this kind of communication, like I said before, it's more like structured communication. Maybe it will be better in the future, but it enables us not like a simple LLM guardrail to apply like a security features, for example, a capability-based authentication, scheme validation, and etc. Maybe in the future it will be much easier for this kind of solutions. In addition, I think like this kind of difference between the vulnerability, we have like more complex vulnerability in the MCP agentic workflow, because now indirect prompt injection, for example, it's a very good example for how these MCPs and agentic apps can be exposed to like a fetch tool that bring prompt injection from the web, or maybe a tool poisoning, like Akram said, or maybe even like a compromised MCP server that we just download to our computer and now have a root access to your computer when it starts to initialize, even if it's not been called. So this all like a new kind of challenges that we need to handle. Also, I think there is big difference in the deployment. Like where we want to deploy this kind of solutions is very different, because from the MCPs, we want to sit inside the VPC in the decision-making plan. And I think for like solution for LLM guardrails, we want to be maybe a reverse proxy. So we want to be in the network layer. So this is very big difference that we need to handle when we're talking about agentic approach. And I think the main thing here that we need to become more distributed with our security approach and to sit in many more parts. So we need to combine these guardrails with the MCP or more agentic security approach.
Yeah, I agree with Thor. And that's where I'm seeing these early stage startups which are mushrooming, which are trying to address this MCP or agentic related security threat attacks at runtime from a full stack perspective, from an application layer, presentation layer, network layer, transport layer. If you take MCP protocol, you have STD IO, SSE, and then the streamable HTTP and so on, right? Different kind of transport protocol methods are there. So there are some vendors who are early on addressing from a full stack perspective across the different layers of the stack. That might be a good approach as well.
Scott, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm on mute. Thanks for catching me. Yes. So, so now that we've been talking a lot about the firewall approaches, you know, what are some of the, and a lot of these challenges we're talking about are also coding-based challenges, right? We talked about how it's some of the components here are Python, editing your tool lists. So, what are some of the best practices to sort of detect, for engineering at least, to sort of detect and mitigate some of these MCP based attacks? And so what are the most critical things people should be looking at? Ophir, what are your thoughts?
I think that's a very good question. Maybe the $1 million question here for this webinar. I think I would have to agree with Akram and Jason. I think awareness is the first step. I think people need to be more aware. There is more room to thought leadership, and people should really try and understand how those problems that they are now facing are very different than the problems that they are used to. You know, API security is not applicable here. Traditional supply chain security is not applicable here. It's a different beast. And I think best practices probably too early to determine specifically for MCP. But I would say what I usually say when people ask me about agentic AI or agentic AI security, I think the basics remains across different, you know, whatever you're trying to secure, the basics still remains. So I think the first thing that you need to think about as a CISO or as an engineering leader is the ability to see, like, what people are doing, what people are using, what kind of MCPs do I have, what people are building with, and what people are utilizing themselves. I think having the ability to monitor some of them and to see how people are using it is also very important. It can give you a good intuition about what kind of risk you are facing. I think taking into consideration the identity part, zero trust, the whole concept that we're familiar from traditional security is still important here. And of course, detecting and responding, being able to find those issues and see those issues when they happen and stop them across the life cycle. So as Akram said before, it's the full life cycle from planning to building to testing to executing to running it on runtime. So I think it's like the basic still stands. And I do tend to agree that there are not many tools that solve all of these problems, but they're starting. You can really find some good ways to start thinking about this problem. But again, awareness, I think we're still in the awareness phase, which is probably the most important task for us right now as security leaders.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think awareness is key, and particularly awareness of the limitation of the tools that you have. So best practices are going to look different depending on if your concern is users consuming MCP servers in their tooling like Cursor or whatever, or if you're some kind of developer implementing a system that's going to allow your end users to use MCP servers or whatever, right? So, but both of those scenarios have real concerns with the security tooling changing underneath the platform, which is a kind of a new novel attack scenario that MCP has introduced. And right now, there's not, that I'm aware of, any tooling that once you've added the server notifies you if the tooling changes, if the descriptions change. The protocol itself has a mechanism that allows the server to send a signal that says, hey, this tooling has changed. But that's on the server to implement that, and it's on the client to do something with that if they get it. And right now, nobody really is. So I think be aware that some of these things the protocol supports aren't necessarily built into the tools yet. And if you are in the process of developing tools, put those checks in yourself, right? Like make sure that you're doing some kind of hash on the tooling description or whatever and checking it before you use the tool. Make sure that you're accepting input from the server that says, hey, my tooling has changed, and then notify the user and say, hey, tooling's changed. Are you still cool with this? I think those are some good best practices that we can start implementing, but be aware in the meantime that those aren't really there or widely used currently.
Yeah, it sounds like something you need to check for any type of MCP server you're going to consume, just to at least make sure that, or understand if they have or if they haven't implemented that kind of notification protocol, so that you can manage that and at least get part of the data so you can start to work with it. Anybody have any other comments or thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think maybe one important point that Jason mentioned here, and we should probably have brought it, I should have probably thought about it before when we talk about API security, but I think very similar to API, there are two sides here. There's someone who's building it and there's someone who consumes it. And both have different things in mind, different risks, different issues they need to think about. And I think education could work both ways. So it's very important to educate people how to consume these things, and as a security leader, what you want to do with people who are using it. But I think there's a big room for us to also spread education, like what Jason just mentioned now about how you build your MCP with the tools changing. Like these are things that are super important. If you want to create more trust in the protocol, if you want to create more trust in your MCP, I think there's a real advantage here, or a real opportunity about developers' education as well. So that's maybe another side to look at it, and another way to think about thought leadership in this space.
I want to add about it. Like, I think MCP is like a API for everyone. So this is what I always think about. Like, if you want to bring a program to every person easily, you can do it with MCP and agent. So I think in the part of education, we need to make it easier to understand how to secure your system, even if you are not developer. It needs to be for everyone. It needs to be easy, and it needs to be enabler. So the next solution needs to be enabler in this kind of idea.
So for folks here, I think one of the things we wanted to do is, if you're getting new into this, what are the one or two things that our audience or we're watching this should go do right now? If they're looking at MCP, if they're looking at agentic, like to get some feedback in terms of what are the one or two things they should do right now to get them better prepared for this. I'll just go around the group here. So start with Ophir. What are one or two things?
Ophir, you're on mute.
Ophir, you're on mute.
Great, thank you for that. So I think the first step that I would start with learning about the technology, about the protocol. I know it's a big thing, and I know people will probably not listen to me on that one, but if you could dive a bit deeper and understand how the protocol works, understand the weaknesses and vulnerabilities, I think it gives you a lot of strength in how to use it or how to build with it. The second thing I would like to stress out is that I think if you cannot read an MCP server yourself, if you cannot read everything that's written there in Python, you should definitely not worry about the security. You should ask someone to help you with the security. So that, I would say, is probably a good advice for implementing something on your own.
Or?
So I think you need to look for official MCP servers. Not try something that open source if you don't understand and know how to read the code behind the MCP server. And in addition, I think I really like the approach for Docker. So you can create a virtual system or Dockerized system that can connect your MCP that you download to your computer. And this is a really new product they developed, but I think this kind of solution starts to bring something new to the security side of MCP. So they can be a good enabler for people that only start with MCP.
Akram?
Yeah, I think the two things or a key takeaway for anyone who's listening to this webinar is I think they should pay a lot more attention to each and every line of the code, the semantics, and they should understand the MCP protocol very well. How is my project going to provide value to the end consumer? If it's an open source project, how can it be integrated with other agentic workflows or other projects? They should have some kind of good clarity, and they need to have good documentation as well. When I say documentation, within the agentic tool calls, there are these doc strings. The LLM looks into these doc strings and takes the decision as to which particular agentic tool caller to call at runtime and so on. So they should have very clear and very specific documentation for each and every agentic tool call. So I would probably suggest pay more attention to the semantics, the syntax. Less code is better if you're writing an MCP server. The more specific that you are, the better it is. And there should not be any dead code at all with respect to an MCP implementation. I think those are the two key takeaways I would say for any developer who is listening to it.
Thanks. Jason?
I just concur with everything everybody said. I think sandboxing is critical. Think about how you're going to sandbox these environments, these servers that you're running, especially if you're running them locally. Akram's point is critical. I think if I had the key thing to think about is be aware what a complicated scenario you're rolling into here, right? So those doc strings that the MCP servers use are what the agents use to decide which tools to call. And you not only have to look at the one MCP server that you're looking to install right now, but you also have to think about every other MCP server that you may have installed and how the agent is going to decide which tools, if there's overlapping descriptions, it's going to call. It's a really complicated system. And we don't have clear answers on how to properly secure this yet. So I think go in with your eyes open and just be aware that that's where we are right now. It's new. We don't fully understand the risks, and that's fine. That doesn't mean there's not things that we can do to try to protect ourselves, like sandboxing, like making sure that we're using, validated, community trusted servers. There's several open source scanning tools that can help protect you from things like invisible Unicode attacks and things like that, right? So I think figure out what your pipeline is, be aware that it's a complicated landscape and that we don't fully understand the risks. And as long as you're going in with your eyes open and doing what you can to minimize the risks, I think you'll be fine.
Thanks, Jason. And so, yeah, I think that it's a big challenge for everybody. A lot of this stuff is moving so quickly. The security around this is all oriented toward new architectures, and being able to dig deep, unfortunately, is kind of, I think, as what I hear from everybody, kind of where we are, using some of your best practices and kind of figuring out a way to dig deep and understand the technology as it's starting to evolve, especially MCP, as it opens up a lot of new risks for folks. So I do want to thank our panelists today for joining us and sharing their points of view. Also, for those people who are watching this webinar, you can also find out more information going to the GenAI Security website. There's a lot of research information that the teams have been publishing around both agentic architectures and security best practices, and also kind of where to start with MCP. So definitely have a look at that. And with that, I'd like to thank again everybody here who's joined our panel, and want to thank everybody online who has joined us. Thank you, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
See you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.